All right. Thank you. I mean, what a fantastic morning it's been. It's really quite amazing. So I'm Mark Johnson. I work for the University of Manchester, and I'm joined by John Torday, who's there. We've been talking about this stuff for a long time, not just about sound, but about distinctions. Really, how do we draw distinctions? Can you hear me at the back? Good. Because Philip mentioned David Bohm, I thought it was worth just sharing this quote. You can't read it all because it's obscured by Zoom. But he says, yes, let's just do that. Where is it? I'll just read it. It's too complicated. Whoops.
Oh, that's okay.
In listening to music, one is therefore directly perceiving an implicate order.
Is what he says. It's in wholeness in the implicate order. And I think it's very interesting that Bohm says this. He talks quite a lot about music in that book. He talks quite a lot about this fundamental relationship with wholeness and being. It's all the way through, and it's to do with sound. So why is sound special? Well, one of the things I think is that when we look at abstractions like Spencer Brown, we look at the mark and we look at the laws of form, the law of calling, the law of crossing. Sound asks some questions about this. Now, I was in Copenhagen for a year last year, and in the morning, you don't hear this in the UK anymore, but in the morning I was woken up by this sound. And it's very interesting because you have to ask, why does the cuckoo have to say cuckoo so many times? Isn't one cuckoo enough? But this is a mark and a mark and a mark and a mark, and you think, okay, so what's going on there? Now, in information theory terms, we would say, well, this is redundancy. This is redundancy in Shannon's terms, that the message is repeated. And it's reinforcing the fact that the message is there. However, something is lost, I would suggest, if we just say it's cuckoo. It needs to be ongoing. It needs to make that continual statement, because that's the dance of the cuckoo. It's also the dance of music.
In particular, this is the cuckolding pattern, etymologically.
Is it?
Yeah.
Right, let's not do that again. And the law of crossing is very interesting. I had lots of discussions with Andrew about the law of crossing. So, what is a cross? Well, is it death? Are we born? That's the mark. And if we cross the mark, we die. Well, sound does this all the time. I made this, I've got some wonderful software which I can show you in a minute, but I made this thing. But this is a proper composer doing this. Is that right? So, Carl Nielsen, Danish composer, writing music to express the rising sun. And I think what's very interesting about that pattern, because if you do a spectrum analysis of that sound, let me just show you actually, I'll see if I can reproduce that pattern. So here's the software which I used to produce that. If I just make a sound like that, there we are, there's the pattern. Now, look at the entropy. Look at the information entropy, because it starts with nothing, and gradually you get more variety. As you get more variety, you have a rise in entropy. And when you reach the peak, there's my peak, how much entropy has that got? None. When it starts to come down again, again, the variety increases, so you've got high entropy gradually falling to low entropy. The pattern, whether it's a coincidence, but the pattern is quite striking because you've got these two identical marks. That's an interesting thing. Maybe it's a sort of just a thing about Shannon, but it's a kind of curious thing there. So, I suppose one of the things that sound tells us is distinctions of processes. They are things that happen over time. And of course, I mean, Lou has done this diagram to talk about the process of making a distinction as a recursive process. But music is a diachronic process. It's a process over time. It's a process of creating redundancy. Sound creates redundancy. I've just said the same thing twice. We do this all the time in teaching. Teaching is pretty much an exercise in saying the same thing in a variety of different ways. I think one of the things that's missing in this diagram is that actually the way we draw distinctions is between us. It's not something that happens within us, it's something that happens within our community. I was thinking about this in the context of Mike's presentation particularly. So you can sort of unpack this. So you can start with a distinction, and you can think, okay, so actually there's always uncertainty. There's always a sort of what's inside the circle and what's outside it. How do you determine that? And in a way you can think, you know, the mathematicians have been onto this. It's Gödel, really. So something has to manage that uncertainty. So let's say there's some kind of meta-system. There's something that is there to control the uncertainty and maintain that boundary. And the job of that meta-system must be to maintain the boundary of whatever's inside the distinction in the context of whatever must be going on outside. Now, it's not an accident that this looks like a cell. And I think when John and I started talking to each other, it was very much a meeting of minds. I was coming from cybernetics and the work of particularly people like Psychophysics, and he was looking at cellular dynamics and the ways that cells have organized themselves in an ambiguous environment. So the detail of this, on the one hand, there must be a function to actually manage the internal uncertainty, that's the green thing. There must be a function to anticipate what's happening in the environment. They must be related to one another. And there must be something that is steering the relationship between the two. And we don't do it individually because we do this in the context of other people who are engaging in the same process. Where is the distinction? It's in this whole process, I would suggest. Now, sound is interesting because what am I doing? Well, I'm engaged in some sort of energetic process because I'm vibrating molecules in the air as I'm talking. And those vibrating molecules are hitting your physiology. They're hitting your cochlea, the little hairs in your cochlea, and the morbid neural and endocrine and nervous stuff that's inside you, which has emerged through evolutionary history. So we have the physiological energy of me and the physical energy outside. Where does the sound come from? Well, there must be potential energy in me to actually utter these words. Where's that coming from? Well, I kind of feel I need to do it. And it's weird, actually, that you feel that you need to sit there and say nothing. That's interesting. The totality is the question I want to ask about. And I think this is maybe in all the presentations I've heard about this morning. We talk about wholeness. I think the real question is about totality. What is totality? And what is the relationship between the distinctions we make and the totality? And I think there's something that we miss. I think there's something that really needs to think about. So there's my math system kicking in again. But this is another way of drawing it. I think that we need what I would call a diachronic switch. It's a bit like the transition in art history when people were discovered how to use perspective. And this is really a way of seeing totality, not just as in our present, and not even in our social history, but in our biological, cellular, evolutionary history, because those cells in my cochlea have evolved. And they've evolved from very primitive single cellular organisms and all the way back to my cells in ancient history. And it's still part of me. And John will talk endlessly, not endlessly, John will talk a lot about the evidence for this, the evidence for the relationship between our own physiology and our evolutionary past, and how this process has been an ongoing process of epigenetic transformation of cellular systems in the context of the different environmental conditions that those systems have existed in, and how through various processes of biological adaptation, particularly endosymbiosis, that our cells carry the memory of their evolutionary history, and this is part of the process of our listening, this is part of the process of our distinction making. And so there's a kind of vector when we listen, particularly when we listen to music, I think. There's a vector that takes us back to our origins. And this probably explains why Bohm says what he says about the implicate order and the relationship between the implicate order and sound music. And here's the totality around it. The totality isn't just, I'm going to just close that down. The totality isn't just the synchronic sort of my making sound, making energy, vibrating molecules, and it reacting to my physiology. The totality is everything from the beginning. And the totality, it's very annoying how Zoom does this actually. The totality isn't, if what Peter will say, Peter sat at the back there, the totality is zero. It must be. And you have a combination of local and non-local factors. One of the interesting questions which we've been discussing recently is whether the non-locality is our physiology, because we've endogenized the cosmos effectively within our own physiology. That's a very interesting question. Maybe this is why music is quite so powerful. And there we are. That's basically Peter's equation. And that's very useful because that gives us this three-dimensional view of totality. Also, it really strongly suggests that this relationship is about energy. That this is an energy dynamic between locality and non-locality, which produces zero. Now, there's lots of physiological, there's lots of biological evidence for this. But I want to talk about statistics. It seems a strange thing to look at statistics and say, well, actually, maybe there's something in statistics which suggests. The reason why I've got interested in this is I've been doing a lot of work with machine learning. And I'm not going to talk about that work now. But that work has involved this guy at the bottom, who you can't read, but this is Louis Thurston, who was a major figure in psychophysics. And first, psychophysics is basically about how humans determine difference. And Thurston made a very simple claim, which is well defended and well understood within psychology, about the way we determine difference between two things. And the way he did it was to say, well, if you have thing A and thing B, and you have a sample of people to show thing A and thing B too, that sample of people will say
this thing is more important than the other thing, or this thing is more beautiful than the other thing. And that those judgments will form normal distributions. And these are the normal distributions. This is from his paper in about 1926 he did this. And actually, this is a very interesting result because it works. And you can then start to put things in order. Now, we've heard a lot about order this evening, that you can put things in order by this pairwise comparison idea that he's got. And that sort of started me thinking, well, okay, well, what about musical phenomena? What about musical ideas? So here are two, these are British cadences. That's the first one. So, whoops. Stop that. The first one, perhaps many people will say, yes, that's very satisfying. The second one, people will say, this feels like it's not quite finished yet. So those are your two distinctions. Now, there are a whole range of grey areas in between that you can do musically. Composers are very good at this because they play with this kind of ambiguity all the time. There's Thurston's paper. Just to illustrate, this is one of the most famous passages in music. Just to illustrate how composers play with this. And when people first heard that, when people first heard that, their confusion was palpable. What is this? We've not heard it. Where is this going? It's not. It doesn't have any kind of discernible, satisfying distinction. And people respond to it differently. Well, it's just a superb example of the ways that Thurston talks about the way we make distinctions. And actually, this particular graph is interesting because these are very close together, these normal distributions. Some things are much further apart. It's very clear to say, oh, this is an X and this is a Y. The closer the normal distributions are, the greater the area that's shared between them, the harder it is to make a judgment. That's where our machine learning has been very useful. Now, there's something about the normal distributions in Thurston, because in order to get a normal distribution, you need an origin. Here's a little video to just sort of, there you go, we've got an origin, and we'll get a normal distribution. So is the fact that we see these normal distributions in the way that people make distinctions, is that actually pointing to the fact that there must be a common physiological origin to the diversity of all of our different perceptual systems? Is there actually is the statistics telling us something about physiology? I think it might be. And so this is a refined diagram which tries to look at a more totalizing representation of that process of our distinction making. And I think the reason why I think this is so important is because we obviously, a distinction very often is a choice. We choose to make our distinctions in certain ways. We make distinctions about homelessness, we make distinctions about politics. And sometimes become a little bit fixed in the way that we make those distinctions, and it becomes tied up with ideology and you get into trouble. But the root of it is that we are all connected because we're made of the same stuff. And just to finish off, to take Lou's diagram, it's the same thing. It's this process of looking back. This is the diachronic switch. Right, that's it.
some time for questions.
No. If I stop sharing. But yes, I can stop sharing, can't I? And then we've got people there.
Are there questions on there right now?
Okay. John, do you want to say something?
Well,
No, why isn't the sound coming through there?
can you hear me?
That's interesting.
As you said, for your presentation, exactly. Click on that and then speakers.
Yeah.
Particles moving into the cell.
But maybe if you're not sharing, look back to
The basis for the formation of physiology through what Lynn Margulis called symbiogenesis. So now you have a two-track system for consciousness and subconsciousness. So that's my take on.
Sure. I hope this makes sense. But in my opinion, our physiology is consciousness. And I think what Mark is describing in terms of that binary decision making is the origin of the cell membrane, making a distinction between outside and inside in terms of particles moving into the cell. And that in turn provided the basis for the formation of physiology through what Lynn Margulis called symbiogenesis. So now you have a two-track system for consciousness and subconsciousness. So that's my take home in my head, which I've shared. Thank you.
About void and silence, whether you see the unmarked state as a silent state or as a noisy state, as we saw earlier today with Andrew's presentation, with the starting with pixelated noise and then sort of isolating fragments from there, or you see it as silent in a Max Picard sense of silence, of just we are always sort of surrounded by silence by the unmarked state. So that's my first question. The second question is feedback, that really sound, whether it's electroacoustic or just purely acoustic, cannot exist without feedback. I mean, like, you have sound bouncing in a room, or you have like sound reverberating in our bodies, and or you have like signals bouncing off on wire, and then we hear that and we can amplify it, or but this idea of resonance as being something that maybe as a sort of re-entry of sound and space. So I guess the two questions are mostly, one is about like feedback and re-entry, and the other is about like the unmarked. Thank you.
Thank you. So silence, I think silence is a kind of ground state. I don't think it's a sound. I think it's a physiological state. And I think that's the conclusion that John Cage is really the person to go to about this. There's a wonderful book on silence.
Yes.
It's a state of stillness, oneness, wholeness. That's silence. In terms of feedback and resonance, I think they may be very closely connected, How do you know that things are true? What is the perception or the feeling of truth? Well, might it be some kind of resonance with the cosmos in some way, that there's something that's feeding back and maintaining a deep sense of aletheia. Maybe that's what happens in science, in empiricism. Is there a kind of... John and I talk a lot about this, actually. We talk a lot about the nature, the difference between the scientific attitude and the artistic attitude. I've always maintained that they're not that different, and that they're just different ways of dealing with the energy of being. But yeah, I think it's difficult to make this. It's a different kind of way of thinking from the sort of traditional sort of causal thing. It's much closer to quantum mechanics. It's much more to do with symmetry.
It's interesting that you set it up this way because, in particular, Ernst Marketplace and his empiricism it plays an interesting role in Husserl's critique and in the beginning of the phenomenological attitude towards positivism.
Yeah.
So that's an interesting direction as well. In Jean Gebser, in the ever-present origin, for whom the shift in like perspectival painting that you brought up, Mach plays an important role there as well. Anyway, I just wanted to squeeze those in, but there are two questions in there, and then
I think John wanted to react to it.
Okay, yeah.
Oh, I just wanted to comment that what Mark has been talking about is fundamental to understanding epigenetic inheritance, which really is the black hole of biology and physiology. So that making the distinction is what happens during epigenetic decision making in the stem cells. Yeah. Okay. So there's a huge implication to what you've just been talking about.
Claudia,
Hi.
it's good to see you.
Nice to see you. Yes, also John. Nice to see you. I was wondering about the representation in this perspective, in the mode of a linear perspective. Because it seems that you lose, by doing that, by using that, you lose the possibility to integrate a local. I mean, maybe it would make actually sense to look at a Chinese perspective where you have a far and near and a kind of land in between, where you could actually maybe generate something that is closer to Leibnizian, called an infinite worldview.
There is always the local is always part of the question, though. It's part of the equation.
Yeah, but I think the linear perspective is maybe not. I mean, it's just kind of pushing it out.
Are you talking about the historical linear perspective?
And then the way you are representing it, because that also makes you think in a particular way.
Okay. Could you think of another way of doing it?
By organizing it, maybe one could try by organizing it in a Chinese way, like a far near perspective.
I'm not sure how that would look, but I'd like to talk to you about it.
One could try. I'm just thinking that this linearity, it's always when you look at a painting that is in a linear perspective, you're always out. You're always out. And what is interesting when you look at the Chinese perspective paintings, that you always draw in.
I've got to think about that. But thank you. Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.